you seen the stories about the demise of the use of cash in our society? Today in 2024, only 16% of all transactions are cash. That's down from 20% last year. Banks are closing their ATM machines and their branches and making it harder and harder for users to obtain cash. The printing and distribution of cash has become so uneconomic that recently the four major banks had to bail out Armaguard, who are the largest organisation involved in distributing cash to ATM machines, to the tune of $40 million, just to keep the company running. And that's only for the next 12 months. It's simply not economic to print and distribute cash for such a small number of users. In fact, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia has predicted that as early as 2026, we may very well be effectively cashless. So what's all that got to do with the price of petrol, gasoline, and the transition from ICE vehicles to EVs? Well, let me help you connect the dots. G'day and welcome to Steve's Tesla. This is my channel dedicated to electric vehicles and renewable energy. Subscribe now and let's drive. Australia going cashless serves as an example of what happens when a once popular product is not used much anymore. The price of producing smaller quantities of any product rises, and the cost of distribution also rises when there are only a few remaining customers. Economists call it supply and demand. In some parts of the world where the adoption of electric vehicles is significantly ahead of Australia, they have already reached the point where service stations are having to close. They're simply no longer economic. In fact, this report by Neo Consulting from 2024 is suggesting that the 7,000 service stations we have left in Australia could reduce to as few as 1,400 in the next 6 or 7 years. Well, surely it can't happen that quickly, can it? Back in the 1970s, there were 25,000 petrol stations across Australia. 25,000. Today in 2024, there are 7,000. So how can that be? Because since the 1970s, the Australian population has at least doubled. Well, back in the 1970s, which I guess was the heyday of service stations, small independent operators could set up a mum and pop style operation and make a living out of it. Since that time, of course, there's been a significant consolidation with the large multinational brands buying out the smaller operators and squeezing their margins to the point where they're no longer viable, so they've either sold up or gone out of business. We have been told that it will still be possible to buy petrol in 30 years' time. I think some people are expecting they will simply be able to pull into a service station as they do today. The reality is more likely that they will have to drive quite some distance to one of the very few remaining gas stations, and that the price of petrol could be anything. Let's say $20 a litre. So as the number of electric vehicles continues to grow in Australia, there just has to be a tipping point where it no longer becomes viable to sell petrol at a service station. Some of these smaller operators can continue to keep going for a while by expanding their additional items and becoming more like supermarkets that sell petrol. But eventually, one by one, they're all going to have to close. This is exactly what's happening in many other parts of the world. We only need to look at what has happened in Norway, where they are almost at 100% of all new vehicle sales being electric already. This is 5 years ahead of when they thought petrol cars would be replaced. In Norway, petrol stations are closing. Some of them have already transformed into EV charging stations, but because so many EVs can simply charge at home, there is not the need for as many EV charging points at service stations as there were for petrol pumps. A recent story from July this year stated that in the Netherlands, half of their petrol stations are set to close in the next decade as electric cars start to take over the market. I suspect that many ICE vehicle drivers today think that in 10 or 15 years' time they will still probably be paying a similar price for gasoline as it is in 2024, only adjusted for inflation. The reality is that the price of fuel is going to go up rapidly and in quite a short period of time. The economics and the laws of supply and demand tell us that the cost to extract crude oil, ship that crude oil across the oceans to refineries, refine that oil into petroleum, and then distribute that fuel to only a few remaining service stations will be as expensive as it is today. However, the number of customers is going to drop by up to 80%. So what do you think is going to happen to the price of a litre or a gallon of gasoline? It is already cheaper to fuel and operate an electric vehicle in Australia than it is to do the same for an ICE car. The average EV driver in Australia is saving $2,000 to $3,000 a year in fuel, plus over $1,000 in service costs by driving an electric vehicle. As the price of petrol for ICE vehicles increases, this is going to be even more in favour of operating an electric vehicle. Also, the resale value of ICE vehicles is going to depreciate rapidly as large numbers of ICE drivers make the switch to electric. So all the evidence is suggesting that the price of petrol is going to increase sharply over the next 5 years or so. By 2030, electric vehicles will represent the majority of all new vehicle sales in Australia. At this point, there will be a rush to sell ICE vehicles, leading to a rapid depreciation in their value. Who's going to want to buy one? My advice is to make sure you are not the last group of people wanting to offload an ICE vehicle in a few years' time. You might just find there is no buyer. Hey, thanks for watching and please subscribe. G'day and welcome to Steve's Tesla. This is my channel dedicated to electric vehicles and renewable energy. Subscribe now and let's drive.